So the trans fats are another interesting story, even better, I think, than high fructose corn syrup. So the trans fats came about in the 1970s also, when suddenly there was a realization that maybe saturated fats weren't that good for you. And so suddenly people didn't want to consume saturated fats anymore. But they still wanted to consume butter, or maybe margarine, which would be a butter substitute. So the food companies decided to supply them with this margarine as a butter substitute, but they wanted to do so in such a way that the margarine wasn't a saturated fat. And to make this margarine, they started out with oils which were unsaturated, like corn oil, which is polyunsaturated. And they wanted to somehow turn it into something that was solid like butter is, so it was a stick so that people could use it like butter and buy their product. And the way they did this is by taking their unsaturated or polyunsaturated fats and adding back hydrogens, essentially creating a more saturated fat from the polyunsaturated fat so that they could sell these things as not saturated fats, but they would still work like saturated fats because they kind of almost, to some degree, were saturated fats. But the interesting thing is that, I mean, you can fully hydrate a unsaturated fat and turn it into essentially a lard. And that's fully saturated in saturated fat. But let's say you didn't want to make a saturated fat because that would therefore be a saturated fat and people would say it's a bad thing. You would want to only partially hydrogenate your fat. And so they added these hydrogens but didn't add enough hydrogens. But in the course of doing this, they ended up with these fats that had these nice little cis bonds and converted the cis bonds into trans bonds. And actually this probably aided in the ability of these fats to stack and therefore to remain solid at room temperature, to be more butter-like. So they created this new thing that they were trying to solve the problem of saturated fats bad by giving them unsaturated fats good, by turning the unsaturated fats into quasi-saturated fats. But in the process of this, they created these things called trans fats. And the trans fats turn out to be really, 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 really bad. Now, why are the trans fats really, really, really bad? I don't think anybody truly understands that. And the food companies say, oh, they're not really bad. And the food companies say, oh, in fact, they're not even unnatural, which may be true. You might occasionally see a trans fat somewhere out there in the natural world. But nonetheless, trans fats turn out to be really the worst thing that you can put into your mouth in terms of macronutrients. Now, it used to be, when I first started talking about this stuff, trans fats were everywhere. When you had just about anything, there'd be hydrogenated vegetable oils in it, and that means there were trans fats in it. And it used to be, you didn't even have to say on the label of these things that the trans fats were contributing to calories, because the trans fats, I guess, are not as easily broken down, they're not as caloric for you, and for whatever reason, you could actually put trans fats in, and that wouldn't even officially increase the amount of calories in the food. And then it was changed where you suddenly had to list the amount of trans fats a product had on the label, and people learned that they did not want to be consuming trans fats. And so suddenly all the food companies wanted to take trans fats out of their foods, and to a large extent, our foods, in fact, don't have trans fats in them anymore. So it's actually nowadays relatively easy to avoid trans fats. But anytime you see something that has on the ingredients partially hydrogenated oil, that tells you that trans fats are in whatever it is that you're consuming. And that is to be avoided.